Majority Report, Michael Brooks here. Joining us now is Cal Winslow. He is a labor historian. He's author of the recent piece in Jacobin Magazine, No Neutrals in Harlan County. Cal, thanks for being here.
No problem. My pleasure.
What's happening in Harlan County? Tell us about this strike.
Well, I think this strike protest might just be winding up for now. At least if what I read in the paper this morning is true. But never mind. Typically, of the eastern Kentucky coalfields and the southern coalfields in particular, the employers have been viciously harsh on their workers whenever they felt called upon to do something. And this time what they did was they just closed a couple of mines and fired the workers and didn't give them their paychecks and left them really in an isolated part of the world like eastern Kentucky, left the miners with very little option except to try to take some action, and they did by first shutting down the railroad tracks and closing off the mine from making it impossible for the mine to sell the coal that it already had out of the ground, and then constructing a camp with supporters there that lasted for more than a month now, I think, and got some attention, and for us, I guess, it also brought back to the memory the bloody story of Harlan County, which goes right back to the 1930s and before then, and that's kind of what interested me, being a historian, I guess, that in times when there's trouble and when workers are moving, it always seems that we hear about Harlan County.
Will you tell us that history, that story of the 30s and before in Harlan County?
Well, the American coalfields were organized relatively early on, and the northern fields, Pennsylvania, Ohio, across that belt, were pretty strongly organized in the 1890s when the United Mine Workers of America was founded in Columbus, Ohio. And a union, a pretty powerful union, organized on an industrial basis. That is, everybody who worked in or around the mine would be a member of the union. It was a pretty strong union, except there was the feeling that the southern fields, as they were called, southern West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and Virginia, were always a threat to the strength of the competitive fields because they were being non-union. They could always be relied on to keep the supply of coal moving, and so numerous times, under numerous leaderships, there was an attempt to bring what were called the southern fields into the Union. And this happened in the 1910s, and it happened for our subject today, it happened in the 1930s, where particularly difficult times for miners, for all workers in the country. So in 1931, when 1/3 of the coal miners in Harlan County were unemployed, and many of those people had been evicted from their homes, and there was no other work in an isolated area like that, the miners struck, and it led to bloodletting on both sides, the intervention of the federal government, and a fight for a union that lasted for almost a decade.
Tell us about the song, Which Side Are You On, and how it fits.
Yeah, I wish I could sing it for you because it's it's very moving.
Yeah.
But the sheriff of Harlan County at the time in 1931 was J.H. Blair. He was a particularly nasty fellow, I guess, but there were plenty like him. But he was involved in a raid on the home of a coal miners organizer. They came in the middle of the night, as they would, and broke up the house searching for the miner who wasn't there, and terrifying the family. So, in response, Florence Reese, who was the leader's wife, wrote the song "Which Side Are You On?" and it became kind of an anthem, first of the mine workers, and then I think for the American labor movement in general. And it says, "Hey, they say in Harlan County there are no neutrals there. You'll either be a Union man or a thug for J.H. Blair. Which side are you on?" And been sung at many strikes and rallies ever since.
What about the United Mine Workers as a union? Where do they sort of fit in terms of their militancy and kind of in the ideological spectrum historically?
Well, I think they shifted. They haven't always been in one particular stance, but an interesting thing about them was, to go back to what I said, they were always an industrial union, and in that sense, implicitly a challenge to the American Federation of Labor, which was based on craft unions. Now,
can you explain the difference to people?
Well, an industrial union would be, say, in an automobile plant. Mm-hmm. In an industrial union, everyone would be in the same union, one union. If craft unionism prevailed, the electricians would be in one union, the machinists in another, the janitors in another, the secretaries in another. Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So a big plant might have 20, maybe more, unions involved in representation and negotiation.
Got it.
So there'd always been a movement for industrial unions in the U.S. It came mainly from the left, from the socialists on the left, going right back to the founding of the labor movement. But it came to a head in the 1930s when the United Mine Workers, led by its president then, John L. Lewis, felt that it was time, with the Roosevelt administration now in office, it was time to organize the workers in American industry. And Lewis and the UMW broke from the AFL and set out to do just that. And in an incredible few years, they were able to organize workers in the automobile industry, the steel industry, the rubber industry, chemicals, farm equipment, you name it, and brought millions of workers who were deemed to be unorganizable by some because they often were immigrants or they were unskilled, brought these people into the union movement in a particularly powerful way, into the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. And so John L. Lewis, and it certainly wasn't all up to him, but at least as a symbol, John L. Lewis will forever be remembered as the person who led to the unionization of the workforce, really, in the 1930s.
And just looping it back now, because we're going to expand the conversation in the next several minutes. But basically, the federal government has agreed to spend $3.72 million to retrain Kentucky's black jewel coal miners. I have an enormous amount of skepticism about what exactly this retraining will entail and for what economy exactly. The back pay checks for the miners have been cut for those in West Virginia, but they're actually still waiting on their back pay in Kentucky and Virginia. And my understanding is that, I mean, this strike was literally about not only were they not getting back pay, I believe that they had actually taken money back out of their accounts that had already been deposited. And of course, this incredible strike happened, and it earned national attention, and Bernie Sanders came and showed solidarity and support. But it's incredibly important, but it's striking that, it's fighting for such a bare minimum in the sense of really reflecting on just the relentless war against workers and organized labor for the last several decades.
Well, you've said it as well as anyone can, I think, there. That's absolutely right, that even though led by sort of West Virginia teachers, things seem to be maybe opening up in the labor movement a bit. We're still mostly on the defensive, and people are afraid to ask for too much. And so even with all the discussion of wages not having improved really in almost decades, we hear of a good settlement being 1 or 2%, hardly keeping up with inflation. And I think that's what's going on with these workers in what's traditionally one of the very poorest parts of the country.
What do you make of this emergence, though? I mean, the West Virginia teachers also in Oklahoma and California, the Chicago strikes in 2012, great union leadership there, and once again fighting, in that case, fighting this, Democratic mayor who was one of the most, active anti-union mayors in the country, the ever odious Rahm Emanuel. We have the GM strikes happening. Looks like a little bit of a similar dynamic of GM at this point, I believe, is at $30 billion profitability, and the strikers are asking for really quite little. The company responded by cutting off people's health insurance. I guess, again, in that sort of similar dialectic of the real incredible relentless war on workers, but at the same time, and you as a historian, you have an article coming out, which I'm incredibly excited to read, about the Seattle general strike. What's the positive end of this equation as well? I guess my question, if people are willing to take the risk to do something as extreme as a strike, when does the shift start to become of, we're taking this huge risk, so how about, equity in the company? How about a 30% raise, or so on?
Once again, you've said it, but I would only add that the appetite increases with the eating, that you might say, and for those of us on this side of things, we have to hope that seeing workers back in struggle, seeing people make gains, even if they're small, is going to be a lesson for other people. And it will lead them to possibly ask for more. But I think that we probably are going to need more activity before we see really important increases. On the other hand, I'm an active supporter of California Healthcare Workers Union, the National Union of Healthcare Workers. And over their past 10 years of existence, you wouldn't know that there was a problem, because they've been winning good contracts, and they've been increasing benefits, and they're a Democratic union, and they're militant, and they go on strike all the time. So, one never knows. You can't tell what can be won until you try.
Indeed. And that may be my final question. What is the difference between, you talk about a successful example like the California nurses. Now, and obviously there's some structural factors in place. We haven't even gotten into, one of Bernie Sanders' most important genuinely revolutionary proposals would be getting rid of so-called right-to-work laws. But when you think strategically and you kind of balance somewhere between the California Nurses Union and then maybe the heads of other major unions, even sort of, helping run interference for candidates running against single-payer health care, which would seem to be one of the most kind of basic things that any union person, anybody with an interest in the middle class and working people would obviously support as a policy unequivocally. Is this also maybe like a time of reevaluation, even on the left, of, going like the ground is more willing to take risks and do radical things than the leadership typically, and starting to think more around working on that revitalization instead of maybe, and forgive me, but maybe folks who've put in some really important work but are also kind of used to being the Washington Generals to some extent for the last couple of decades.
Well, I think a very strong argument can be made that the most important changes have come about not just in society but also in the labor movement itself, that they've come about as the result of movements from the bottom up.
Yep.
We might say. So to go back to Harlan County, really that era symbolically began, in a sense, with these obscure coal miners in eastern Kentucky who had just had enough. And then, going back to what I said about John L. Lewis and the movement that began at the time of Roosevelt's election, what happened was coal miners apparently heard of the new administration in Washington and got the idea that President Roosevelt wanted them to join a union, and started flocking into their union headquarters literally by the thousands, so that there were reports from union officers and organizers saying they couldn't keep up with the number of people who wanted to be in a union. And it was that, it seems to me, that said to John L. Lewis and the others, hey, we can do something, but also, looking back at that period of time, we better do something, because along with everything else, and I don't know that Bernie Sanders fits right into this picture, but people are starting to think of different ways of going about things, doing things, and that includes workers today, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I think that you're absolutely right, and we need to really keep an eye on what's going on with the rank and file workers, and especially at a time, I shouldn't end up with this, but a time when the ordinary General Motors workers are trying to run a strike when their leaders are trying to stay out of jail.
Well, there you go. I think you distilled it. I guess I have to say I'm more charmed by those ones than the centrist wonk ones. At least there's some fun to it. But Cal Winslow, I really appreciate your time. People, read this great piece, No Neutrals in Harlan County, and look forward to a forthcoming piece in the Monthly Review Press about Seattle's general strike. And I'll just say, in addition to it being a fascinating piece of history, it was a major point in sort of, basically radicalizing America's oligarch class because they were so terrified of what was possible. Cal Winslow, I really appreciate your time.
I appreciate being involved in the discussion, and so thanks very much, and keep up the good work.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.